couple years ago, Miyazaki had an interview where he listed 50 of his favourite children's books and kind of just like what was inspiring him to write and just like what really had an impact on him. And so I wanted to read some of these. With The Boy and the Heron coming up soon, I wanted to immerse myself in these books. I read some of them a little while ago and then I read some of them now because I actually wanted to make this a while ago, but I didn't realise that the film wasn't releasing in England for like months. Like I started reading them in like July and then I didn't realise that it wouldn't come out in England until like December. So it's actually not even out yet, or at least the version I want to see of The Boy and the Heron, which is subbed, not dubbed. So the dubbed version is currently out, but I want to see it subbed because it was on like 2040 anime Tumblr. So, you know, the subbed versus dubbed debate was really hard. And I guess I lied on the subbed side a bit more than the dubbed side. But I will say the actual dubbed version for The Boy and the Heron is apparently pretty good, and the actors for it are like very, very great, so I can imagine it being good. I wanted to read some of these books just to sort of like get a grasp on the types of books that he likes and what really inspires him. I didn't want to read like anything that actually inspired any of the works that he made, so Ariete, I don't think he made that one to be fair, but that's a Ghibli film. I didn't want to read like Howl's Moving Castle or any of the ones that were like actually adapted from a book. That's not what I wanted. I wanted to read some that he thought were great but weren't like actual adaptations. But more specifically, I wanted to look at books on the periphery of his favourites, just things that weren't actively inspiring but instead had a moment of inspiration within his larger body of work. So I picked around 5 different books to read. That's more than I usually do, but the children's books, so they're easier to read and quicker. So I picked some of the ones that I wanted to read, things that were perhaps already on my list or things that piqued my interest. Like I went through the entire list, there's 50 of them, and some of them I was just like, I don't really care. And some of them were really long. And I picked the ones that spoke to me more than others. I usually do like a vlog section in these videos, so I usually cut to vlog, but I'm not gonna do that because I think the main thing I want to vlog is me going to see the movie. So there'll just be a clip now of me going to see The Boy and the Heron, and then I'll give you my opinions afterwards. Like hopefully it's really good and I really like it. I've already heard rave reviews. Like obviously it came out in like July, so people have already been seeing it for a very long time. It's only just like been released now. So I just came back from watching The Boy and the Heron and I honestly didn't go in with any expectations or knowledge of the film. The only thing I knew was that the heron was a bit weird. Like I knew it was like a little kooky. I didn't know anything else, so I wasn't really expecting anything to happen in this, and I really am surprised with what actually did happen. Mainly because obviously I filmed basically all of the video that you are watching before I went to see the movies. This is like future me. I've already edited that video as well. I thought I'd give my opinion on this movie anyway. A big thing in this movie is like a very introspective look at legacy and like handing over the torch of the world or like the legacy or everything you've built from the perspective of someone who's meant to take on that legacy. And that is so interesting, specifically because it's a really contentious subject around the idea of like Studio Ghibli. My friends have been saying, you know, this is probably the last big Studio Ghibli movie that Miyazaki's gonna make, or this is the last Studio Ghibli movie that's gonna be good because this is the last one that Miyazaki's gonna make, even though obviously Miyazaki's not the only director. But the big thing is that he wants to hand it off to his son, and he doesn't really believe in his son, or like he was kind of, he's not that interested in his son's project. A lot of this story is really about like the son being able to choose what happens to Miyazaki's legacy, and that is such an interesting take because obviously this is Miyazaki's film. He is making it and he's like, okay, perhaps I'm okay with whatever my son is willing to make. I don't know if that's really reaching. I think that really is the text of the movie, and I wasn't expecting that because I was just expecting a story about themes of the world and maybe war and maybe loss and grief, and those things are in there, but a lot of it really was about him. And I don't know much about him aside from this specific thing because it's kind of like in the cultural moment. When you talk about Studio Ghibli, it's something that comes up regularly these days because it's like in the news when we talk about Miyazaki, it's something that's happening to him currently. But I don't really know anything about him personally, so whether or not anything in his older films like really reflected what was happening in his life at the time, I can't really say because I wasn't around then. I don't know much about him. I've never really done too much research on his personal life, like what was happening, who he was married to, where he lived, things like that. I've always just been more interested in his work. This having such an actual strong correlation to his actual life was really interesting, because this is the first Miyazaki I've ever seen as it came out. I've never seen any of them in the cinemas before. I've never actually waited to see one. Like, I've always just watched it online or watched it in class or watched it at the cinema after it came out, like years after it came out. So this was such an odd experience. I think all of his movies are really weird. I don't think this was any weirder than any of the other movies. I just think it was profoundly personal in a way that I've never seen him be. Like, I don't have that personal relationship with him because I've never looked him up like that. But something that kept coming up to me was how much I really liked the sound editing and the score for this movie. It was really beautiful. I don't know if I'd ever really cared about it. Maybe it's because I saw it in such a big theatre instead of just watching it at home. But I was like really into the music that was in this. I've never really cared about them. I know that, you know, they are like nice and flowy and ethereal. Everyone always talks about the score, but I've never really cared about it when I'm actually watching the movie, whereas this was such a quiet movie with basically no dialogue. And the main character is also kind of not expressionless, but he doesn't really have facial expressions really expressing what he's going through the way that like perhaps Kiki from Kiki's Delivery Service does. So this was very different because the music is doing so much heavy lifting emotion-wise, and that was very intriguing. I'm not sure exactly what the main plot of this is thematically saying yet. I need some more time to process that, but I really liked watching the movie. I've been waiting for it to come out for ages because I tried to make this video ages ago, as I said. Yeah, a great experience, and I am happy that I watched it. I'm a really big fan of Miyazaki's work, but like, who isn't? He's very mainstream. He's kind of like the Japanese animation guy, you know? It's not like a weird thing to say, but you know, I like him a lot. I don't know if I like him more than other people, but you know, I wrote about him in my personal statement when I was trying to get into university, so you know, I have a long-term relationship with the guy. And Kiki's Delivery Service is one of my favorite films. I have my entire Notion set up to represent that. Look, can we see my Notion? Yeah. Love his work. So I just wanted to give some of them a try. The first one that I read was The Fool. And so this is a Russian story about a fool. So Ivan the Fool is actually, I think, the whole name of the book. And Ivan the Fool is about this family, every single person in this family being given a devil to sort of inspire them to do bad things. And Ivan, who was a fool, doesn't really think of anything conniving to do. He sort of has this really naive mindset, but in the end that makes him a really morally upright and pure character. It follows the story of him and his family throughout their lives and how his family take kind of advantage of him, but also they just go off and build kingdoms. They want money and power, whereas he doesn't want that. When he gets power, he doesn't like it. He wants to come back to his farm and work on his farm and really just help other people out. It's a really interesting story of being very grounded, and perhaps the people who have simplistic lives have better lives. That's a very far-reaching idea for what is essentially a kind of morality story, a very sort of fable-esque tale, instead of something that had a larger motif of, you know, maybe we should just be calm, maybe we shouldn't be reaching out for things. But again, it is very simple. Ivan is not a very complex character. He just is naive. So it's very be good, don't do crimes. But I really liked it. I think the entire premise was really sweet. And also it kind of puts people who have a lot of power and money in a very bad light. And that is an interesting book for somebody as rich as Miyazaki to personally promote. I think I always find it a little bit perhaps reprehensible when people who are really famous really like sort of anti-capitalist stories. And it's like, yeah, but you're the problem. The next thing that I read was The Flying Classroom. One was the one where I really felt that he would adapt this. Like, I don't think the exact story is something that he would do. It feels a little bit like From Up on Poppy Hill, but like, it's not that weird, but it's just got a nice feeling, and it's set at a school. It's at a boarding school in Germany about these kids who go to school there. They're putting on a play. The play is called The Flying Classroom. So it's about them flying through the world and learning things as they end up at different places within the world. And it's sort of like supplemented by the actual stories of what's going on in their school. So there's some kind of bullying, there is a rivalry with a local school. I think those ideas really feel like Miyazaki's own work, like it would be in his actual stories, a really toned down, simplistic idea in a small rural town where there's just like a school and like local amenities. they're really good friends with this one older man who lives nearby. And, like, he kind of tells them moral stories. They really like him. He is approachable to these children. That kind of figure, again, another one that really made me feel like it was one of his films. This definitely had the tone that his films take. This book also looks at privilege and money as a big part of it. There's one character who at this boarding school can't go home. He has no money, and therefore he basically is always hungry. He's always a little bit behind, and the other characters kind of like come together to be able to help him out and go and see his family again for the holidays and things like that. It's a really sweet story, but it has this sort of grounded, naturalistic idea to it. Like, it's set at the holiday times, and it's got a very nice story of helping each other out and the camaraderie of friendship within these boys. You know, they're getting into trouble together, but they're also helping each other out. It has a very gentle and sweet look on friendship between boys, which I think is something that perhaps gets marred as they get older, whereas here it's a very nice, like, kind of saccharine feeling of these guys like helping each other out, but also beating up the boys from the school that they were having a rivalry with, which is also an interesting touch to keep the plot tense here. The next thing that I read was Wind in the Willows. I picked this one because I already wanted to read it. I never read this as a child, and honestly, I don't know why I would. I don't know why this is like written as a children's book. Like, this is publicized as that, and I read this and I was like, so befuddled. I was like, what was the decision here? Because Wind in the Willows, okay, I will also put a disclaimer to say that I thought it was Frog and Toad. Okay, like, if you know what Frog and Toad is, like the book Frog and Toad for like children, I thought that's what Wind in the Willows was. Like, I thought Frog and Toad was like a spin-off of Wind in the Willows. It's not. There's just another character called Toad in Wind in the Willows. I will get to that though, okay? So a big reason why I thought it was because they all like dress up as well in this. They like wear like coats and like Edwardian clothing, which is what Frog and Toad also wear. So I was, you know, I don't think I was that weird in messing that up. However, this is a much more like grown up story. Like, Frog and Toad is like very casual vibes of like them going out and getting ice cream and them chilling together and them going fishing and whatnot. Whereas this was very weird. So this is about Mole, right? So Mole comes up outside of their hole that they've lived in their whole life to kind of just try and make some friends. So they make friends with Rat and Badger. All of this, fine, like, brilliant, love it. They then meet Toad. So Toad is like rich, and I don't really understand how Toad is rich, but like Toad has a house and Toad is rich and Toad is like sophisticated, and that's great, good for Toad, right? But Toad is nuts, and I wasn't expecting that. It came out of nowhere. Like, Toad is like mental, and Toad has a car, okay? I'm going to spoil this for you, but like, just whatever. Toad has a car. So Toad is a real Toad, okay? He can speak, obviously, they're anthropomorphic, but he has a car and he keeps getting into car accidents, and that is genuinely the plot of this book. I was like, what the fuck is going on? Like, Toad is like in love with like being a reckless driver, and he just wants to go on like joyrides, and he keeps getting into accidents, and then he gets thrown into prison at one point, and then he escapes from prison. It's the story in Wind in the Willow. I was always under the impression this was like a sweet story about like animals going on picnics and chilling together, the same way Frog and Toad is. They do that at one point. Like, you know, they go out for dinner parties and they casually have like get-togethers. No, that's not really what this is about. This is about Toad being nuts. There's a whole bit in here where Rat, Badger and Mole have to look after Toad to make sure that he doesn't go AWOL and start doing reckless driving again. I was like, what? I can't imagine this being in a Miyazaki film, but it's such an odd premise that this is such a famous book as well. Like, this is like a well-renowned children's story that people like really hail as a classic of like English literature and within the canon, and this is what it's about. I'm genuinely so confused, but I can't even imagine, like, I can't even recollect how bewildered I was as I was reading this, because Toad just gets like more and more nuts, and you're just like, oh my god, wow. But yeah, it's just like very interesting characterization of these like animals, because I don't think toads have this like sense of being rebellious. Like, that's not a characteristic given to toads. I don't mean like toad, you know, because like there's this idea that peacocks are proud and ants are busy and things like that, but like toads don't have that specific trait attached to them. This is something that was given to them by this author. I was expecting like a cute story about the forest, you know, Winnie the Pooh style, not this. So the next thing that I read, I'm going to fly over a little, and that is The Little Prince, and that is because I didn't really get it. I know this is like a lot of people's favorite, okay? I also know this is like James Dean's favorite book. Like he used to annotate the shit out of it. I think I said this in another video. I can't even remember what other video I read this for. But yeah, nuts. Like I don't get this book. I don't really like it either. I don't think it's particularly interesting. It's about this narrator meeting the Little Prince. And the Little Prince has gone on all these adventures and he's kind of recounting himself going to all these planets, meeting all these people and what he's learned about life. And it's meant to be this really sort of well-regarded, introspective idea for a children's book, and I just don't get it or care. I might need to read it again. Maybe I read it a little too fast to take in the notes about the world that this author was meant to be like giving off, but I just didn't care. Like I just didn't like absorb it in any sort of functional way. I was just like, okay, this exists and I see why this could perhaps be sweet, but this seemed really pretentious in a way that I don't like. Like I didn't think this was giving me any information. I was just sort of like, I guess it's a nice little story and I can understand what you're meant to infer from the actual like tales the Little Prince tells the narrator, but I'm just like, you know, I like the little drawings that were accompanying all the stories. I think the inspiration that comes from this, at least for Miyazaki, must be from the morals of the stories that the Little Prince tells, because the narrative structure of this is obviously quite odd. It's quite experimental in a way, but I guess not for children's fiction. I think children's fiction does play out like this a little bit more. So I do get why he would like this. I know a lot of people like this, but it didn't really resound with me. You know, this wasn't for me. I don't know, because I can't imagine this being a children's book either. I can't imagine a child reading this book and understanding it. So I'm like, I think perhaps you do need to be a little bit older to understand it. And as somebody who is older and reading this book, I still don't like it particularly. So maybe I should read it again in like 6 months or like in a couple years, because I've heard like some people come back to the story and like it more. Maybe because it's my first run through and I'm just like understanding the structure of the narrative, and then I'll come back and really get the messaging and like drive that home a little bit more. Because yeah, just as something that's a bit of a cultural phenomenon and a really well beloved book, I really didn't see any positives to this aside from the fact that it was kind of cute. Like the Little Prince is a fun character. He's amusing. But anything other than that, I can't really tell you. I didn't care. So the last two I read were short stories. They're from two different collections, but they are short stories. I read some of the other ones surrounding these in their own collections as well. The ones that I read specifically were The Restaurant of Many Orders. So this is in a collection of Japanese short stories for little children. Or like, they're like fables. I don't know if they're for little children because they're a little creepy. So this one's by Kenji Miyazawa. This one really reminded me of the beginning of Spirited Away, which kind of like didn't piss me off, but it did piss me off a little bit because I was like, I went out of my way to kind of not find or read any of the ones that were actively inspiring the stories he wrote, but this was clearly just about the beginning part of Spirited Away. It felt like the bit with the pigs, if you watch Spirited Away, and it was just like a very interesting story about a restaurant and how it lures these two hunters in a forest to it, and they essentially become really enraptured within the story and orders of the restaurant. And I don't want to spoil it. I feel like maybe I should, but I also don't want to, especially because I don't want to give the story of Spirited Away because that's very clearly inspired by this, I think. And it was very creepy. It was really good. It really made me want to read some of the other ones, so I did. And I think the eerie kind of vibe is seriously emulated within the beginning parts of Spirited Away, where that ominous atmosphere is created for the main character to sort of live in and try to comprehend. That was very clear from reading this. Even speaking about it now, I'm actually really intrigued to read more by Kenji Miyazawa because I'm just like, it is really unsettling. Like the story, when you're reading it, you don't really know where it's going. You kind of just keep going with them, like processing the world that's being created for the restaurant with the main two hunter characters. And then you're like, oh, okay, I understand. I see where this is going. I also understand where Miyazaki got some inspirations from. So that was cool. It was cool to see that. I would love to actually see perhaps more stories that were actively like integral to world building for Miyazaki, but weren't the actual story. If that makes sense, like if Howl's Moving Castle is a representation of that book in movie form, I mean like a story like this where there's just like one scene that is inspired by a book. Like, I think that's such a cool concept. I just went and looked on Google just to check whether Spirited Away was inspired by a book. It's not. It's not. So yeah, I really would like to see what other little stories come together to form these bigger narratives within his book, because he clearly reads a lot, and he clearly reads a lot of children's fiction. And so the last thing that I read was this little short story called The Man Who Planted Welsh Onions. So this is such an interesting story. Okay, so it's about cannibalism. I wasn't expecting that, right? So it's a little fable story. It's a children's like fairy tale type story. I don't think it's a fairy tale, to be fair. It's kind of a bit dark, but I guess like the Grimm's, they're called fairy tales, so I can see where that comes from. The first thing that I want to talk about with this is that this man lives in a community where they all do cannibalism, so they're all committing cannibalism, and then he's like, this is fucking weird, we need to stop being cannibals. And he goes around the world searching for a different way to live. Like, how do you not live like cannibals? And he finds these Welsh onions and these people who only eat these onions, right? They've decided not to do cannibalism anymore. They look at cannibalism as backwards, but they eat onions instead. He takes these onions and he wants to go back home. He wants to go back to his own community and spread the word of like, let's not be cannibals anymore. And he takes these onions and they don't recognize him because he's been gone for so long that they eat him. That's what the story's about. He goes out to try and stop cannibalism and he brings back these onions. He plants them. He comes back to say hello to everyone and then they eat him. However, plot twist, the actual onions start growing and then the people in the community just start eating the onions. I don't know why they've decided. That's a bit, out of nowhere. That's the fairy tale aspect of it. But they do pick up on the onions being there and they eat them. And they stop doing cannibalism. I wasn't like entirely sure what the moral of that story was. Like, that you can do a good thing and then you might not get rewarded for it anyway because, he brought the onions to their society and then they ate him anyway, but then they got the reward of stopping cannibalism. Perhaps this idea that, you might bring something good, but you might not be around to see it happen, that you shouldn't just live for yourself, you should live for other people. I don't know. Like, it's not like he's really happy that he did this and then died, because we don't see from the character again after he's eaten. We just get told that they started eating the onions. But it's such a shock to the system when they're like, oh, and he gets eaten. You're like, this story is only like 4 pages long, by the way. Like, it's a really, really short story about him just like deciding to leave, finding the next people who eat the onions, coming back and then getting eaten, and then they pick up on the onions being there. It was a real like nail-biting story for only 4 pages. And those were all of these stories that I read to kind of figure out different parts of Miyazaki's style and just see what he's inspired by. What are these books that he really likes and why does he like them? I think he likes them because they're not always linear. They're also sometimes quite paradoxical. They can be kind of odd. They're not always, sweet. They are sometimes a little bit more grounded, they're moralistic, they say something about the world, and I think that all of those things are embedded within his work. And clearly when you are inspired by a work of this kind, it helps you infuse like some parts of those into your own work. Like, he has a really sort of serene quality to some of his work, right? And I think that is really important. Like, it's made a massive impact on other work, and it's also a big part of kind of building relief within the entertainment and media industries. He's such a formative part of the way that we see Japanese culture, because we see it as this like interesting and sweet thing, which perhaps it's not, but sometimes when it comes to his work, he gives this place of respite within media. It also tells me that he's very well read. He's very internationally well read as well. A lot of those weren't Japanese. I don't know if he did that on purpose because he was giving it to a international publication, and it perhaps means that he wasn't giving as many Japanese recommendations as he might like. Maybe he wanted to give a list that was more catered to his worldwide audience instead of just something that would be accessible to Japanese people, because some of these, like the short stories are hard to find. Like, they basically are like on Internet Archive. They're not really like on print or on like Gutenberg press or anything like that. Like, you have to go find these. But all in all, he has a very endearing taste, which is clearly reflected in his own work. I think he's touched the world in such an interesting way. And now I'm going to go on to let my future self give some opinions on The Boy and the Heron. Hopefully you liked this video. Give it a like if you liked it. Maybe subscribe if you liked the video enough and you thought my opinions were good. I don't think this video was as formatted as I would liked it to have been. However, I'm going to put it out anyway. And yeah, Miyazaki, I will always look up to him. He is kind of one of the best of all time, and it's gonna be really weird if this is actually his last film. Like, I've not finished watching all of the Ghibli movies. I think I've watched all of the ones he's made, but not all of the things that the studio's made. But yeah, I'm really interested in him. He's a very sort of reserved kind of guy. He doesn't always care about things, and that kind of grounded mentality is in these books. But also a lot of the affectionate ideals that are in these books are also in his work. So he is a cultured and well-rounded man. Maybe he will inspire copycats that don't really leave either of those things behind, because I think being both grounded and cute and nice to look at, because I think having both the peace and the grounding is also important. Thank you for watching. Hope you have a great day and an even greater week.